I'm Annalisa Enrile of Goodniks, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them.
Hello and welcome to MetaPod. This is Wendy, your host for this episode. Thank you for tuning in. As you might know, MetaPod unpacks the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them. And if this is your first time listening to MetaPod and you love hearing about podcasts, guess what? You'll find more episodes featuring more great podcasts at metapodshow.com. So this week's guest on MetaPod is Annalisa Enrile. She's presenter of the Goodniks podcast. Goodniks explores the journey and meaning of doing good in the world through personal, first-hand accounts of activism. The voices featured in Goodniks suggest that everyone can do good in the world, whether that's in your community, your job, or just your personal life. Stories are told by a range of normal yet exceptional people: social service providers, nurses, movement organizers, police officers, and political activists. When not presenting Goodniks, Annalisa Enrile is a professor of social work at the University of Southern California. She's also a human rights activist who fights against human trafficking, and she's quite passionate about the power of storytelling in education and activism. As you'll hear, we discuss some of the common threads among people changing the world in big and small ways. Annalisa's down-to-earth sensibility and humor come through in this behind-the-scenes conversation about the issues that Goodniks explores, including some of the more challenging aspects of activism and service to humanity. I'll start the tape. Annalisa, welcome to MetaPod. Thank you so much for coming to talk about Goodniks.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited about this project. So it's great to get to talk about it.
Yeah, so the project is fairly new. You are the presenter, and the show examines what it means to do good in the world. Now, I want to ask about a very small, but I think special detail in the introduction to the show. You make a point of welcoming not only those who are doing good already, but those who might be just thinking about it. And when I first heard this, I thought, oh my gosh, maybe she's talking to me. What was the idea behind that small gesture? And then more broadly, who should listen to Goodniks and why?
So I'm really glad you noticed that small gesture. It was actually something that we added after we had listened to all of the different interviews that we did, during the season. And that was because there was a very real, I think, tangible need in the world now to want to do good, but not knowing how. And one of the things that all of the people we interviewed said, all of our Goodniks said, was I felt compelled to do good. I felt a problem that needed to be solved. I didn't know how to start, and then I just did. And we thought, there's so many people, there must be so many people out there in the world that just want to do some good, don't know where to start, or don't feel they have the capacity to. And I think that the strength of this podcast is everyone can do good in their own small corner or big way. And that's really, I think, makes this a podcast that, anyone who has been involved in like movement building, community organizing, service to humanity, or changing the world, this is your podcast. But it's also for those people who are like, God, I want to change something. Where do I start?
Yeah, I mean, I was impressed with the fact that you included a nurse or a policeman. So they are not just these people, like you said, movement builders, but all types of people.
Yeah, I am a social worker by training, and I, often am around these people that are doing extraordinary things. And I think that, we're living in a time in a world where we are finally recognizing the role of these critical roles that first responders play, that teachers play, that grocery store workers play, and redefining also what good means. Because I think it's daunting and intimidating when, you think of like doing good in the world as, these huge macro changes. When it's so, I was just talking to someone yesterday who said, you know what the hardest thing is about changing the world? And I said, what? And he said, to be kind. Like kindness is difficult sometimes.
That's interesting. I actually thought about that before we were talking. Kindness, or maybe lack of kindness, someone must be on the end of that at some point in someone's efforts to do good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I am also a professor and have students who are earnestly engaged with wanting to impact the world's wicked problems. And we always start at the point, and I always try to make the point that, wicked problems exist, unfortunately, because there are some people that benefit from it. And so that is what makes it so intractable to try to solve, because people are fighting to keep that advantage. And so it makes things that seem very natural, like kindness and love and belonging, really paramount and difficult. And I think that is one of the strengths that our Goodniks represent, is this humanity and vulnerability, and almost normalcy of, wow, this work is really hard for some very basic reasons that you never would have guessed.
The idea of power in a very raw sense, as a struggle between, let's just say, good and evil, I noticed this doesn't really seem to come up in the way that your Goodniks talk in the podcast. And that might just be language that they're using, or maybe a choice that you've made. There are a few conversations where people explain moments where they realize they're working against these institutionalized power structures that are much larger and more powerful than any one person, but still the language differs from some of the more fiery language that we might typically associate with activism. In your experience, is there a difference between doing good and activism, or is this just about language and perhaps a more self-reflective state of mind in the podcast?
I think that every act of good is an act of activism. And, I also believe that we are socialized into thinking that activism looks a certain way, that it's on the street, that it's in protest, that it is, fire behind your words and your actions. And that was maybe one of the best lessons that I learned in hosting this podcast, are all the different ways that activism actually shows up. There is an example of, our ICU nurse that talks about how she learned, care from her mentor nurses, and doing things like grounding a baby, which you don't have to do, but which is like the humane, proper, kind thing to do when you're taking care of this small life, and trying to get them to, get past this crisis. And to her, that is an activism, or a type of activism. I think that in part it is language, because we are becoming a world that is really sensitive to lexicons now, and of how we bring people into a space. So, getting rid of some of those really intimidating words and making it so that anyone, right, could be inclusive and belong and engage. But I also think it's a great lesson in folks that have been doing this for a long time, like those types of lessons that you learn. One of the themes that kept coming up is you can burn out very easily. You could get discouraged very easily. You have to keep your mind on the long game of change and of doing good. And sometimes that means retreat. So several of our Goodniks said, at a certain point, I had to say, I need rest. I need to realign. I need to recover. My favorite line from Audre Lorde is that rest is an act of political, it's a political act. And I agree with that. And I don't mean in the self-care sense like that we hear about with wellness, although that's important. But I don't mean like, Wendy, go get a massage if you don't feel good that day. I mean
I'd be
like,
happy to, though.
yes, right. But, I mean it more in the sense of, a realignment, a checking in with yourself, making sure that you have a very strong support system. One of my favorite, we're not supposed to have favorites, but one of my favorite Goodniks that we interviewed is a young woman named Jessie who talks about, we cannot be activist at the detriment or dismissal of our own families and needs. And she said that that's been one of the biggest balancing acts. And I think that that's the same with a lot of the others we interviewed, and a lot of people in the world that are doing good, is how do you create that balance between what the world is asking of you and what you feel committed to, and also what your immediate life and tribe needs from you as well.
You have talked with your Goodniks about what I would call some counterintuitive strategies for doing good. And that may be things like you said, stepping back to take a break, asking for help, examining yourself and your own contribution to overcoming or maybe even maintaining the obstacle at hand. Are there other counterintuitive strategies that you hear about from your Goodniks?
Yes. There's a great example. One of our Goodniks talks about being really successful as an artist and activist, and so successful that he gets invited to the White House to, engage in an executive appointment. And this is really a lesson in who you are versus what you think people want you to be or what you're supposed to do. And, that appointment came with a lot of prestige and a lot of feeling of kind of like moving up, whatever moving up means and progressing means. And then kind of stepping back and saying like, no, wait, I'm really an activist that needs to be in the field and not in this 9 to 5 having meetings. Although in someone's world, that's important as well. And I think it's counterintuitive because we're very much socialized to say, I'm going to climb this ladder, whatever that ladder is, of whatever society says is progress, whether that is your ego, materialism, fill in the blank. So I think it takes a lot of bravery and counterintuition to say, no, wait, I need to put a pin in this or put the brakes on and step back and say, this is actually not where I'm most effective or most happy, and I need to get out of it. And I think that is, Bozeman St. John, who does a lot of organizational leadership stuff, she says, we have to be willing to say, wait, I failed. I did it wrong. Oh, wait, I did it wrong again, and be able to back up again, which is very counterintuitive because a lot of times when you're in these positions of creating change, you yourself become aspirational to those that are working with you. Mm. So to be able to say like, wait, I'm going the wrong way and stop, and then have it actually be a stronger, better decision is, I think, the pinnacle of being counterintuitive, because oftentimes we are like, keep going, we're going to solve it. Yeah. And it just, doesn't work that way.
Aside from presenting the Goodniks podcast, you're a clinical professor of social work at the University of Southern California and a human rights activist. Do podcasts or any other sort of audio storytelling play a role in your work or mentoring or activism?
Absolutely. I think storytelling in general is so powerful, and a good story, the unveiling of a voice that we don't hear, of a narrative that we don't get access to, can really make all the difference. I can assign students articles and articles to read, and the power of hearing a 5-minute narrative almost is, more compelling because they resonate it with it. They see it, and they see that story in their own lives and experience and those of their clients. If we're talking about social workers and other human service providers. And yeah, it's pivotal. Education is changing. And we can no longer be kind of in that ivory tower where we are assigning readings that may or may not have any impact, or pieces of research that, exist in the ether somewhere. And we have to find ways, I think, to engage students' curiosity and their imagination. That to me is the first step in igniting what they are going to do in the world with these degrees. I'm convinced now that there's nothing more powerful than storytelling. And because of the pandemic and everything being like on Zoom and so much content being available, and you could pick up your phone and see anything, you could put on an Oculus and be in a totally different country. That audio power of being almost just with yourself in this silence that only includes another person or a few other person's voices is also viscerally powerful. And so I think that has something to do with it as well.
Yeah. Over the course of the episodes of Goodniks, you point out some common threads that I think you've come to learn about people who do good. And one of those is doing good tends to start early. Another one seems to be having a mentor who champions your work. For listeners who haven't heard Goodniks yet, what are some of the other common threads that tend to run through people who do good?
I think one of the common threads is the belief that change can happen. You have to believe that the work that you are doing contributes to the larger paradigm of change, whether those are very, very small things or huge sweeping policy changes, or movement building, as we've been talking about it. I think the other a couple of the other pieces is to be willing to be open. To be willing to be open. And one of my favorite episodes talks about like, how did you know you were on the right path? It's a little bit woo woo, but like, were you listening to what the universe was telling you? And in that episode, we talk about like this theme around that is very similar for a lot of them, which is to be open to things that you might not be comfortable with or that you maybe have no experience with, but leading you, in the direction of the work that you want to do. So many of the people that we interviewed said, I didn't think I could make a living doing, this thing that I was passionate about. And yet, here I am doing it. And I think that another universal is the idea of community and collaboration and nobody getting there alone. So, being able to build those communities and the importance of relationship. So no matter how big of a movement that you're building, it's always based on relationship and people.
Mm-hmm. A very important and I think challenging episode of Goodniks is episode 8, which is where you have people talking about how they continue in the face of adversity. And you list 5 things that make a difference in recovering from adversity and persevering. Gratitude for life, relationships, as you just mentioned, belief in what's possible, emotional strength, and belief in something greater than yourself. I promise there's a question coming here. I think this was my favorite episode. When adversity strikes, it's tempting to shut down, but you also say that tragedy and trauma can lend a new perspective and foster growth for people. And then you pose the question, when something bad happens, what do you do? Do you give up or do you reset and recommit to doing good? My question is, and I think you've talked about it a little bit already, but when is it okay to give up? Or is it more a matter of reframing what giving up means and looks like for someone?
I love your question, by the way. It relates actually to an earlier episode that we did. I think it was like episode 3 or 4, where we basically say what happens when you fail and how do you give that up. And it was really funny, Wendy, because when we were doing the interviews, that was a question I had to ask a couple of times. And the executive producer, Jeff Leitner, at certain points, who was there at all the interviews as well, would sometimes have to jump in if he felt like we're not getting like to the answer. But what we soon realized was that many of our Goodniks were like, what do you mean give up? And it was, it was a very, and it was a really kind of interesting process. But, in terms of when do you know, in terms of when do you know when to give up and how do you do it? Is that what you were?
When is it okay? I think maybe that's a different, a personal, emotional sort of reckoning with yourself. Like it's okay to stop this, or it's okay to give up because of whatever reason. Maybe forgiving yourself is a way to think of it.
Yeah. So for most of our Goodniks, the answer to that question is kind of like, if they knew that they did everything possible to address the challenge, the problem, that, whatever it is, fill in the blank, and they did everything possible that they could, they wouldn't necessarily love the process of letting go, but they could do so, knowing that they gave it their best shot. But also, I think that is a recognition, to your point earlier about personal limitations, and also kind of understanding I could only take this so far. And then the belief that we have hope that someone may take it further, like nothing is certain. There's constant change. And so this is maybe not fully giving up, but letting it go for the moment or for somebody else. And I think that, quite frankly, that's the most difficult challenge of all for all of the people that we interviewed, for all of the Goodniks. And, this episode 8 is also one of my favorites in terms of how do you grow from adversity, whether it's personal. So many of our Goodniks shared these beautiful personal stories, and how difficult it is just to see yourself in the situation and to have to come to that reality of this isn't working and I can't shut down because of it. And I think that that was also kind of a universal theme between our Goodniks, which is there is going to be trauma. There is going to be tragedy. How do I take a beat from it and then start to grow and start to pivot? And, what you were talking about in terms of realignment, I think it's a huge challenge. And in many ways, it's what keeps them going. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard a few stories where sometimes that's coming from within, but sometimes it's coming from without a mentor, maybe giving honest feedback about something.
Oh, absolutely. I think that again, one of the things that I know I learned was this role that you can't do it by yourself. And that the idea of something horrible happening, right? Some kind of trauma, tragedy, et cetera, happening, and that you have to bootstrap your way out of that situation is actually a harmful idea or a harmful way of thinking, because oftentimes we might not have the wherewithal to do that. And so to be able to reach out to, the communities that you have built or work with, to be able to say, I need help in this, or to be able to rely on others to, as I was saying earlier, maybe take your place for a little while. That's really powerful. And I think that is also what has kept people on track. Yeah.
You raise a big question in maybe episode 8 or 9 about whether doing good makes you a good person. And I'm guessing that there is no single or simple answer to that question. But it did make me wonder about or the flip side of that, if not doing good makes you a bad person. The question, I guess, is, does guilt motivate people to do good? And are there healthy and unhealthy motivations for people to pursue doing good?
I think as a social worker, I'm going to say, yes, there are a bunch of different unhealthy motivations and a myriad of different reasons why people are compelled to do good. I was just having a conversation with a very good friend about our defense mechanisms and how altruism is actually a defense mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
that we have when we do something bad, we want to make up for it. So, we do the complete opposite. But one of the things that, with our Goodniks at least, that folks that we interviewed were very clear about was that none of them felt like the work that they do or the communities that they serve is a burden,
Mm-hmm.
or that they feel the weight of guilt or shame or even a negative type of responsibility. And that to me was really quite joyous about the way that they described their work as a partnership, a creation, co-creation of something better, and seeing while recognizing that there are these very hard junctures, but that it's worth it, and
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of what you have to pass through. There's this, I think it was in episode 9 where we talk about what would you tell your younger self.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everyone was like that it's really hard, but to just keep going. And I think that maybe that speaks to it a little. I love your question in the sense that I think it is important for people to ask why they're doing good, because I think at the end of the day, those reasons have to resonate also with who you are and the legacy that you want to leave. Or maybe that's really grandiose. Maybe it's just about like how you want to live your life. And I know that we've been talking a lot in the world about social justice and equity and diversity and inclusion, belonging.
Mm.
And I think the most important point of that discussion is, how do we stop being performative? Like, how do we stop doing good or acting in a certain way just to make it look like we're doing good? And how do we
Mm.
really just do it? The latter is so much harder. It's easy to be performative, it's easy to look
Yeah.
and say the right thing.
Well, particularly easy on social media, I suppose. With
Absolutely.
and I suppose it comes back to what we were saying earlier a bit about kindness and my idea that there may always be someone on the short end of the stick, I suppose, in what people are doing. Maybe I'm just too much of a pessimist.
No, I think you're a realist. It sounds,
You're being kind, Annalisa.
I'm trying.
Honest, that's good. So the podcast has 10 episodes, is that correct?
Yes.
Will there be more Goodniks coming in another season or another?
That's our plan.
Okay.
It's been a great experience, not just getting to work with these, 10 incredible people and learning about what they're doing, but also the process working with our team has been a great area of learning for me, a lesson in kind of storytelling and curation, in terms of how best to get people's stories out there. But I'm just so excited. We've been getting so much feedback from other people saying, you have to talk to so and so, or I want to hear about someone doing work in this area. And it's really, I don't know, soul affirming. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that's the right term. Um, so it's something that I definitely hope continues. It was, like I said, a great project, and really affirmed like the power and reach of people's stories.
Yeah. And to maybe wrap up on a positive note, what's something that someone did for you that was good recently, or a moment that you realized that someone was championing you?
Um, I work with a great tribe of women, specifically, and because I've done a lot of my work in the women's movement, and my area of research is in human trafficking and modern day slavery. And so, let's see, a recent thing that someone did that was good for me. Actually, just this morning, I had a student reach out to me who had a very horrible situation and incident, and it just froze me for a moment because I really wanted to respond like in a way that was both empathetic and helpful, but her situation was so horrific that I just kind of froze for a moment. And I turned it over to a colleague of mine and I said, hey, I just need some help with this. I want to respond appropriately and correctly. I don't want to get this wrong. And I think in that situation, it would have been very easy for her to say, I trust you. You know what to say to her. Or here's a number of somebody that could help you. But instead, she sent me this very beautiful email that had 10 resources in the community, that had verbiage and language that I should use. And then also at the end said, if there's anything else you need, please just call me so that we can make sure this woman gets what she needs. And I thought that was such a great way of response, of seeing not just that I wanted to help, but the way that I wanted to help, and of being able, to champion my own capacity to be built, as opposed to also just saying, okay, just send her to me and I'll take care of it. And I think that that's part of championing, is being kind of that moment of learning and of expansiveness and abundance, which is almost as hard as kindness. So, I mean, if we're making a list.
Well, Annalisa, thank you so much for talking to me about Goodniks here on MetaPod. Your optimism is very inspiring, and I wish you continued strength in the good work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to share. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you to Annalisa for an open discussion about some of the more challenging aspects of doing good in the world. Like she said, even if you're just thinking about doing good in your community or personal life, Goodniks is food for thought and a source of encouragement that everyone can do something to aid change. You can find Goodniks on the web at goodniks.org. Goodniks is also on Twitter and Instagram, and they've got a newsletter if you're interested. There are links for you in the show notes. If you have feedback about this or any other episode of MetaPod, send a note via Twitter at The MetaPod Show. Also, your ratings and reviews are appreciated on Podchaser, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to MetaPod. Those interested to hear more from social activists who are also podcasters might be interested in an upcoming episode of MetaPod featuring the Reverend Billy and Savitri D of Earth Riot. You might know Billy and Savitri from their performance art and activism around issues of capitalism and consumerism. The pair have been active in New York City over the last few decades with their Church of Stop Shopping. More recently, they've extended their action to issues related to climate change and the environment. Earth Riot is a fairly new project of theirs, and it's an entertaining mashup of environmental news, thought starters, music, song, interview clips, and most importantly, imagination. I hope to have you back for that soon enough. That's all for now. Thank you for listening to MetaPod. See you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time.
This episode of MetaPod was recorded, edited, and produced by me, Wendy Morrill.